Hi, everyone. Welcome to the new season of our Center for Information Technology Research in the Interest of Society lecture series for the People and Robots Initiative. We're delighted to have you here, and for everybody who's accessing online. We have a great lineup of speakers this spring, which we sent around on the emails. Jeanette Bogue will be here next week. And today, though, we have a fantastic speaker. She's someone that I've been wanting to have here at Berkeley for a long time. She is very inspirational. She is a consummate engineer, but also a dancer and a performer, and thinks very deeply about dance and the idea of controls and art. She did her undergraduate at Princeton in mechanical and aerospace. And so she did a thesis there that was that won an award, was recognized as an award for exceptional research. And then she went on to Georgia Tech, where she worked with Magnus Egerstad and worked on pursuing these ideas about dancing and control of humanoid robots and robot motion. Then she did a dissertation. She's getting a lot of attention, and she went to University of Virginia for a couple years, and then landed at the University of Illinois, where she runs a lab there, the RAD lab, Robots, Art and Dance.
Robots, Automation, and
Robots, Automation, and Dance.
Works.
Okay, good. I'm close. But and then she's done many publications. She is also a trained, authorized dancer in the Laban method, which hopefully she'll talk about today, which is a method that dancers use to annotate, and it's essentially a language for dance and movement. She has written a huge number of papers and a book that I was fortunate to be part of on controls in art that she edited, and she's just incredibly productive. She's going to tell us about some of the projects, and tonight, actually after this talk, at 6:30, she'll be going into a more detailed talk about the art side of it, and today she's going to give us a little more of it from the engineering perspective. So please welcome Amy Viers.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here at Berkeley, and I know Ken said we're in a bigger room than usual, so please feel free to pretend we're not in this arrangement and interrupt me if you want during the talk, because I'm happy to pause and rearrange and change how much I spend. I have too many slides, as you might expect, and so I can hop around as needed if stuff comes up. So I'd be happy to entertain questions as we go. So let me reset my timer so I have a sense of where I'm at. My research, I like to frame what I'm doing and why I'm doing it around this observation that movement seems to express information. And some examples of this, we see fish schooling, and we know that when one fish notices that its neighbor fish is pointing in this, is moving over here, it sort of aligns its heading and adjusts its proximity based on the motion of this fish. And that creates this coordinated behavior. If a shark swims up here, these fish will notice that, and their movement will inform the movement of these fish and inform the movement, and so on and so forth. And so you get this really informative, functional, productive movement that also is quite beautiful and interesting to look at. Humans do it too. Here I have an example of dancers all linked together. The movement of this guy is informing the movement of this guy, and so on and so forth. And then I have this example where you've got two people actually in a very similar pose, and yet we see two very different scenes here. Like, this person seems to be in an emergency, this person seems to be jumping for joy, and we're seeing that through elements of their pose that are meaningful to us in these contexts. And I also love, I read a book about octopuses recently, and this is sort of just there because I thought they were cool, but we know nothing about these creatures, and even whether they're social animals or to what degree they're social animals, but we look at their movement, right? And we try to interpret their internal state and the patterns of their internal states through that movement. And that's really what we want to be able to do with robots too. And so if movement is communicating something to us, I think as good engineers, we should go kind of to the source or the authority on communication, which is Shannon's model for communication. And I'll just like highlight the different pieces if you're not familiar. But the idea is that, you know, we have some information source. We have to build something, engineer a machine, a transmitter, or a scheme to encode the information of the source in some way. We're going to communicate that across a channel. The channel may be noisy. Things may happen in between when the message gets to the receiver, which we have to build also. And then some sort of decoding scheme gets us to the destination, right? And this is sort of this underpinning model that telecommunications are using to be quite successful at communicating information between systems. And I like to sort of abstract this model, first of all, to create an organization for my talk, and also to hopefully make the work that I've done make sense. And so I sort of lump all this together, and here I call this like a model for expressive robotic systems. And I'm going to think about a robot as my information source. And I'm going to realize that that information source is completely separate, but yet hugely dependent upon the environment in which a particular interaction is happening and the human that is watching the movement of the information source or the robot. And I'm going to think about the theater, the stage, which I'm on now, as a test bed for trying to understand how these three elements work together. So let's start by talking about the channel, because I think this is maybe the most unusual component of the way I work. This is the way I work. We really think a lot in my lab about what choreographers can teach us and make us to be better roboticists. So I'm going to take this choreographer and I'm going to use him as my agent for a series of tasks that we're going to layer. So this is our standard classic robotics task example. Get from point A to point B, right? This is like robotics 101. And okay, so there's lots of ways I could get from A to B, right? Lots of paths I could take. Right now, I didn't say get from point A to point B with minimum energy, right? So there's lots of solutions, lots of movements that would solve this task. Does it make sense so far? Now I'm going to layer something. I'm going to layer the very thing from our previous picture. Now walk from point A to point B in the presence of a friend. And does this change the task? Maybe, maybe not. We're gonna keep going, so I'll go through several iterations of this. I think it does. I think now the solution to get from point A to point B is to walk in a way that looks expected or socially acceptable or makes me seem competent. I can't just meander from point A to point B as I want anymore. I have to do it in a way that seems like that gives the right impression to my friend. So the presence of another counterpart can change a task. But I haven't said anything about environment yet. So let's bring that in. Now, get from point A to point B in the presence of a friend in a living room. The solution needs to change. Now I say the solution is something like tries not to look stupid while avoiding couches. And here's where I think, let's add one more thing, and then we'll be kind of at the peak of the mountain here. So now the task is get from point A to point B in the living room while communicating anger to a friend. And now what should the agent do? Just like in all the previous tasks, we need to choreograph some movement that solves this task. So what should the agent do? Usually I make people give me answers, but this stage is making it feel very like I should just give you the answer. Okay, well, I'll give you the answer. Oh, yes, great. Love that idea. Love that idea. Yes. So stomp with heavy, sure-footed steps. That would be a great choice that you could make. Ooh, well, that's a great idea. I didn't think of that one. But let's say instead of throw, you kind of slashed your arm. Slash arm wildly. I'm gesticulating too much for this microphone already. So, okay, so this was my solution. I think there's many solutions that would work. I love Ken's idea. Thrash arms wildly, slashing at the air, stomp with heavy, sure-footed steps. I think that would communicate anger to the friend while avoiding couches. Or maybe not. Maybe throwing yourself over a couch. So great. So this must be angry motion, right? We found angry motion. All right, I'm going to keep going. Now the task, got rid of the friend. New environment. I'm in a jungle, trying to get from point A to point B. Nobody's even around. What motion, instead of just like units, discrete units like couches that I need to avoid, I have this thick, encompassing undergrowth with vines and plants and things intertwined. So to get from point A to point B, I need to slash my arms and I need to stomp with heavy, sure-footed steps just to get through the jungle undergrowth. Do we kind of agree with that? And if I add my friend back in this scenario, what am I communicating? I like that. Careful or competent, maybe in a hurry. That's like the most intense version that I can imagine someone thinking when they see the same motion profile in a new context. So this example illustrates a couple things. It illustrates that the channel matters, context matters, the environment matters, and that all movement is expressive. And we can foreground or background the expressive component or the functional component, or we can talk about it. But here, this expressive idea, where I was communicating anger to my friend, it serves a purpose. It functionally serves me. If I couldn't do that, I couldn't communicate my anger to the friend, and I wouldn't get the pizza toppings that I want, right? And over here, the same motion profile that had nothing to do with communication is also extremely functional, right? And also expressive. It expresses competence. Doesn't express the same thing, but it's expressive in both scenarios, and it's functional in both scenarios, and it means something different in each one, which is completely predicted by Shannon talking about, bits getting flipped in the channel, right? I mean, it aligns to that idea. And so then, when I come to examples like this work, which I love and think is super fantastic. They create this model, they use animator input, it works really well, the user studies go as desired, but they come up with examples like gaits, which are happy and sad and energetic and tired, feminine, masculine, and neutral. Those are the whole sort of suite of gaits. And they use animator input to create it, but they come up with these labels. And these labels are in a little bit of tension with that previous example, right? Because if I take the happy gait and I say, put it in a field of garbage, which these are a little hard to see, but this is that exact gait that Etmod and Aria created through their animators and their interface. And I put it not on a white background, but on this field of garbage. And now I'm going to ask people, I actually asked people a variety of things. I asked people, how would you label this in a forced choice manner, or can you rate on a scale from 1 to 7 how happy it is? We've done a few variations of this, but actually, I think I'm going to tell you about a few variations of this. So in this case, we're asking people to label the effect that they think that the gait is supposed to have. So we give them the choice of happy, neutral, sad, energetic, tired, and then they're going to pick what they think the gaits are, and we're going to do it across a range of backgrounds. We're getting these backgrounds from the OASIS reference database. So all these backgrounds have been previously tested with people and rated in terms of valence and affect, which we're going to use later. So we end up with a bunch of new animations. And in red, we got wrong answers. In blue, we got right answers. So for the most part, these plots are all red, right? Like people just labeled all over the place. And I like to highlight a really unsuccessful and a really successful one. So they weren't all the same. Happy, the happy sequence, was more frequently labeled feminine than happy, and it was labeled happy about randomly. So this little yellow bar is like kind of random walk in terms of the labeling. And so happy was really poor across all these, really dependent on context. Masculine. The masculine sequence, which kind of lumbered with these wide steps. So relying on some pretty outdated modes of what gender means, but very well recognized. Frequently people got that one right across all of these different backgrounds. Masculine is kind of an idea of a physical characteristic of a body, right? And happy is something that I could be happy one minute and sad the next minute and tired the next minute and back to happy again, right? So it's something that we expect to vary, and therefore I think it makes sense that that was especially dependent on the context that we viewed things in. So what happens, in this original study when they said, how happy does this gait look? We can then give people that same task over again on the white background. And then we ask people, after they do the task, where do you think that happened? And these results are a little more all over the place, but you can see that there are some sort of natural groupings, like the beach and the nature and the lake scene were more likely to be associated with feminine and happy in a way that wasn't quite random. Whereas the masculine gait, people frequently associated with the soldiers or just the destruction or this sort of scene along a road, maybe in India somewhere. So with two men standing there. So I think what happens when you ask somebody, how happy is this gait? They construct a scenario in their mind where, oh yeah, that would be a happy gait, and you can see lots of videos on YouTube that tell you, oh, here's a happy gait, and we kind of imagine, oh, they're walking through a park. But if all of a sudden you're walking with like a gun to your back, jostling around, it's like manic instead of happy, right? So a very similar movement profile can mean something very different. So what do? We're going to label. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all the backgrounds, war, grass, city, and I'm going to ask people to use a particular series of questions perfected by psychologists to locate these stimuli in this like a 2D model of affect, valence and arousal. Positive valence, negative valence, high arousal, low arousal. So something like happy is in this quadrant and something like tired is in this quadrant. And I do the same thing with the gaits. And now I can create a linear model, very simple, that tries to predict what the recombined gait and environment thing will be. And this linear model, so here's my context valence and arousal pair, here's my gait valence and arousal pair, and we have a very bad spread with arousal, so we don't have a lot of things to say there, but here in this, for the valence number, it's almost equal contribution between walking, the gait itself, the variation of the movement, and then the environment that captures sort of at least our data set. So the context matters, and we need to model the context to understand what something expresses. Now let's talk about the receiver, the person, unless there's questions. So here's my question. Are these two things the same? Are they doing the same number of things? A lot of yeses on that. Their temporal timing isn't perfect. Like there's some moments where it looks like one is ahead of the other. Of course, that only perceive that if I think they're kind of doing the same thing. Otherwise, they're just doing random things, right? So it's not completely disassociated what the two of them are doing. So I would entertain arguments for yes, based on that, but maybe slightly temporally out of sync. But then also, I will share that Joel is about 6'2", and Varun is about 5'8". So physically, they can't be doing the same thing, right? one is tall. I mean, Varun can never get his ears up to the same height as Joel's ears, right? So they are two separate bodies that with some rehearsal, I would say, could look like they were moving in unison. And this is true in all dance moments, right? Like, we're all our own unique bodies. So I think that in rehearsal, we could, in addition to correcting them on some timing issues, talk about intent, talk about why is the arm extending, and we could align the delivery of the movement as well. Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Something on the guy on the right seems a little less into it. Yeah, kind of like,
he doesn't have as good of a performance face. But even Varun, he's kind of pursing his lips in a couple moments. So, Joel's the inclined head, kind of like, yeah, do I really want to be doing this? Now you know what engineers feel like when they come to my lab. But no, they're a good sport. Okay, are these the same? No, totally not. Well, we said the previous one wasn't the same from some angles, so for sure this one is still not. But there was a much stronger reaction to no. So defend no. If you were the one who said it, sorry, I don't know. Oh, it was you back there behind me. Sorry. The body part is different. Oh, that's a great descriptive observation. Yeah. Does anyone want to argue for yes? Usually people laugh on this slide. You guys didn't really laugh. But isn't there something sort of funny about it? Like, there's this thing, and then poof, and then down. Like, there's something actually quite similar. And in this case, they're quite temporally synced. Like, it seems like the four things that are happening like at a better timing. Maybe? Does anyone want to see the yes? Like this moment where they go, whew, and whew. Isn't there something similar about that? Or here where they gather? Okay. Do we think maybe it could be similar? Wow. Did you see my slides before? Because you said stomping too. Yeah. Great. Okay, great. So, Ken mentioned this. In my lab, we use Laban movement analysis, Bartenia fundamentals, something we call the Laban-Bartenieff movement system, to describe movement and to create this kind of unison that you're seeing here. Choreographers developed this to better create unison among a bunch of distinct bodies, and to think about movement in a sort of abstract way. So one of the things that we've used is something called motif, which is a shorthand for notating movement that is use some similar concepts and symbols to Laban notation, which is a more rigorous, detailed notation. It moves this way. The length of each action stroke indicates the length of the relative duration of the movement that it represents. And these symbols come from a series of categories about abstract ideas about movement. And that's exactly how these two sequences were created. So Joel was given, each of them received it and then interpreted it in their own way. And so we have here this arc-like mode of shape change where they're both arcing. Joel's using his hand, Manav's using his head. Then they have this gathering moment, this flick, this moment of quality that seems similar, and then they go to this play slow. So yeah, they both had these flexible instructions. The instructions need to be flexible when we have the first two guys who are trying to do the same thing and need a little bit of editing. And they also need to be flexible to kind of highlight similarities between movement that's not quite the same but has something in common, right? So it's a sort of a series of perceptual lenses that help us reason and talk and identify and observe movement. And so in particular, we're kind of interested in this case where I might mocap the person and put that movement on the robot. Something I've done. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. but I am trying to point out they can never be the same, right? This robot is a different body than that human. Even if I had two humans here, I'm saying they could never exactly be the same, right? But maybe perceptually we could get to a place where they do seem the same. And so we're using sort of high-level features about movement, abstractions, broad senses of the thing, to find similarity between distinct bodies. So, for example, we worked with a dancer who was obsessed with two different professional dancers' performances of a piece called Petite Mort. And he felt that this pair was so much more convincing in the role than this pair. And we had a very kind of open-ended conversation about why that might be, and we sort of zeroed in on this idea of verticality, of the relationship between the uprightness of the spines of all the dancers. And we felt that explained what he was seeing in these two different executions of the movement. And so we did some analysis. I'm going to actually skip over this slide and go straight to, we also used it to generate, well, the analysis says that there's some sense of if these two guys, if these two guys have their hands attached or not attached, there's more synchronization when they're attached of their uprightness in their spine over time. And so that seems like, okay, that seems meaningful, right? Because we would kind of expect that there'd be something similar about two people who are physically attached while moving. And so we use it to drive robot motion as well. So here I have two robots, one that has 1 degree of freedom in its configuration space, and one that has 2. So it has an orientation of uprightness added. And I'm driving the motion of each from this mocap data. And I'm taking these very simple things, and I mean, I don't know, do you think they look the same? Like, they kind of do, and they're very temporally synchronized. They seem very temporally in sync. And so when we ask people, we've done sort of, I'm showing you data from 3 cases. One where I took the little Roomba-like robot, and one of them is randomly, the signal that is creating it is random, with some, we tried to pick a periodicity to it that imitated the human, so it's not like at a high frequency. And then one is being driven by the mocap skeleton itself. And we asked people which one of these is imitating this. And for this little robot with only 1 degree of freedom, they kind of picked randomly. Like, sometimes people picked the random robot, and some people picked the non-random robot. But when we do it for this, we called it a broom bot, this upright thing versus this Roomba-like thing, people almost always picked the upright thing. And similarly, they were able to distinguish between the randomly moving upright thing and the non-randomly moving upright thing. So we can think that they're the same, or we can at least, operate under this idea, right? And motif helps us identify the features, and dancers, when they watch movement, help us identify the features that need to be the same for us to think they're the same when they are not. So then we use this motif work in another manner, which is we want this person's movement to go on all 3 of those different robots. And so we're going to ask the person to notate their movement in a simplified set of motif symbols, and that's going to be our robot program that we send to all of these different machines. And so we do that by taking the robot, this is the Baxter, and my student is moving the arms through what in the Laban system we call a movement scale. So just like when you play the piano and you are trying out, I don't remember exactly how the scales work with a piano, but you have this idea that you're sort of spanning all of a particular way of playing music. That is what these movement scales in the Laban sequence do. So they sort of span all the sort of spatial fiducials that people might think about moving, and then we collect those poses as he's moving in a database. And so now these poses are all indexed by these motif symbols, and we can produce movement on these 3 distinct platforms that imitates that original sequence. We're not motion capturing, we're asking the person to tell us what they did. And for some reason on this slide, a different video always craps out like that. It's so strange. And then we ask people, are these the same? here's this person, here's these 3 robots. We said, are these the same? They watched a video. And for 9 different sequences of movement, I'm picking sequence 9 here, which we did really well with, we asked a new group of people, are these things the same? And for most of them, for the Now and the Baxter, we do pretty well. Mostly we have more green than red. And even for this non-anthropomorphic Kuka U-bot with 1 arm, for a couple of the sequences, we convince people that it is imitating what this human figure is doing. So again, when things aren't the same, they can actually be the same. And we've used this system to create a teleoperation scheme that allows us to operate the robot in a somewhat live manner. So on the left, we're asking someone to specify the position of each arm joint directly, and on the right, they're specifying these high-level symbols. And so it's moving the robot through these poses that are in our database. And what's nice about this way of thinking is that on the left, where we're specifying each joint, here's a recording of movement in how many joints on Baxter. And Baxter, of course, has these compliant joints where sometimes you get a little bit of extra motion that you didn't specify just because of the compliance. So in one moment, there's 2 joints moving, but for the rest of the time, there's only 1 joint moving at a time, versus on the other side, where we get like as many as 6 joints moving at one time. And now we've taken these, well, first we've asked people how they rate the 2 movements, or rate the 2 methods of teleoperation who were operating the things. And people say that this first one, where they're moving 1 at a time, felt safer, easier to use, more precise. But this other one, where more things are happening at once, they called more fluid, more expressive, and was preferred by the people who were most successful at the tasks that they were given. So kind of an interesting, and what we're really interested in this is not so much, I mean, making a teleoperation method could be cool, but that's really not the thing we do in my lab. What we're interested in is understanding why people associate these qualities with the resulting movement. And so now we're taking a new group of people, asking them to watch the videos that these users generated, and then to answer, okay, so you watch this video, which of these adjectives would you associate with these videos? And we're finding that, similarly, people call this one where more joints are moving at once more fluid. And I think this is really exciting because people always ask me, oh, you're making graceful robots. And I think, oh my gosh, I don't even know, or you're making robots that have human-like motion. But I don't even know what human-like motion is. So how could we be doing it? We're really trying to think, what does that qualifier mean? It's a qualitative idea, but it must correspond to some sort of quantitative component of movement. Maybe it's how many, or maybe one aspect of it is how many joints are moving at once. So people perceive crazy things, is the point. Now we can finally talk about robots. We've talked about environment, we've talked about people watching them. Now we can talk about robots, and we're going to be really thinking about some qualities. So I think this is what we want. This is like a goal image. What is going on in this scene? And preferably someone who hasn't seen the movie, but or doesn't remember it well. Okay, that's a conclusion. What do you see in the image that makes you think that? Yeah. So do you see the structure of that interaction? She said, oh, they're collaborating together, or they're looking at something together. This is a high-level activity that then I asked, okay, defend that conclusion by looking at something that's going on in the scene, which she articulated really well. And I made similar observations. The robot is pointing instructively out into the distance. The robot is leaning casually into its human cohort. We could keep going. Importantly, C3PO is played by a human, right? And there's a director off screen making sure that the movement of the robots and the movement of the actors looks right, right? But we'd like to be able to do this automatically. And so I always try to zoom in on this idea that the fact that it's pointing and leaning and not pointing angrily but pointing instructively, or not leaning aggressively but leaning casually, is what makes us think that this is collaboration, that what makes us think that the artificial movement of the robot is right, or is communicating the right message, right? So, okay, I think you got information sources. Could all robots swap in for C3PO and still make the scene work? And this is the question that dancers ask too, right? Like, I couldn't jump in on the New York City Ballet stage next week and do it right. Like, my movement wouldn't communicate the right idea, right? And so similarly, maybe we could start to ask that about robots. Like, we've said that all movement is expressive, but maybe not all robots are as expressive as each other. So to think about this question, I did something very simple and stupid, but kind of interesting. So let's just look at this plot first. The x-axis is time. The entries in the graph are a variety of robots and they're placed when they were released. And then in the y-axis, I have the number of transistors on the onboard, like CPU, like how fancy was the computer inside each robot. And I'm thinking about this as a measure of how complex their internal state could be. It's actually a huge under-approximation of how complex their internal state could be, because they can all be connected to the internet, right? And they can all have way more complex internal states than just what's on board. But it's a nice measure. Then on this one, same set of robots, same time axis on the x-axis. On the y-axis, I've just counted up how many shapes I could make with each robot. Like, how many C3PO moments would I have, like, that if I took a snapshot, could I create? By the way, this is what Gordon Moore did to think about the progression of computers, right? And he found that this was doubling. And we've used it. It doesn't tell me a perfect, computers use clocks, right? And like the speed of the clock really matters. The dynamics of the computer really matters in terms of its performance. But this is a benchmark that tells me something about how powerful that computer is. And it's the same benchmark as this benchmark, actually. So this tells me how many static shapes I can make. This tells me how many static states I can have of all my transistors. And I'd like to compare the two numbers. To do that, I would need to take 2 to 10 to the 6th, right, to get the number of combinatorial states that these number of transistors that have 2 states on and off could create. That would be a very big number. So instead, I'm going to do log base 2 of this number. And now I'm going to plot them on the same plot, because I'm curious about complexity of internal versus external state. I'm curious about how many robots I could switch in for C3PO. And when I do that, and now I'm plotting it on a log-log plot. These are logarithmic plots also on the y-axis, semi-log plots. Here it's log-log. So when I see this here, which is the change in the computational configurations, the number in base 2 or the number of transistors, I see this explosion. Like the internal complexity over the 15-year period that we're looking at just like exploded, right? Because this is a log plot. And on the y-axis, I see almost no change over time, and certainly not really a trend over time. And so I find that interesting. And then I just find that interesting. It's a pattern. But people hate these plots. And but here's why I tried to make people like them more. And they like them a little more if I do this. So now what I'm going to do is add animals to the plots. Same plot as that third plot. But now I have a variety of animals. I have C. elegans, fruit flies, cats, and humans. And the C. elegans are black, and the rest of them are blue. The rest of them are blue because I completely made them up. But the black ones, I used a paper that fully characterized the movement of, strongly characterized the movement of C. elegans. Was able to do things like, now if there's a heat source, they can predict what the C. elegans will do, something that people thought was random previously, in response to that stimuli. So they really understand the behavior of C. elegans in agar. And what they find, they take 100 joint angles, they parameterize this curve. This is a C. elegans, it's a little microscopic nematode. And they parameterize this curve with 100 numbers, which, if you work with motion capture, is like so many numbers, right? Like that motion capture is about, like, I don't know, 50 or so. And then they do a linear decomposition of the space of all these 100-dimensional vectors, right? So each moment of the C. elegans behavior is a little time slot in this time series, and they do this linear decomposition, and they find 4 parameters, a linear combination of 4 parameters that explain 95% of the behavior. So they find a low-dimensional manifold to explain the behavior. One of these 2 numbers is really quite representative of C. elegans behavior. I say that it's this one because this is exhibited behavior on agar, and I know that if you move them into the wild, I feel that if you move them into the wild, they will do something different, and probably you'll need more than 4 modes. But either way, it sort of bounds all of my robots in terms of this y-axis. Now, on the x-axis, what I did is I put them where they would go if each neuron was a transistor, which is not a great, which is an under-approximation, but is a way of thinking about, C. elegans are simpler than humans, we think. Does that make sense? So it allows me to think about, this was the title of the talk, Expressivity in Natural and Artificial Systems, a way of, it's not about Newton, it's not about how fast everything is moving or how hard everything is moving, what the force or the torque or the displacement is, but how complex is it instantaneously? Which I think is important for things like dance, right? If I just had an LED and it could just be on or off, I could read you Moby Dick, right, if I encoded everything in Morse code, but it would take me a really long time and it would be a really boring show or movie, right? But if I use human bodies, I can communicate Moby Dick a lot faster, a lot with richer detail, and well, at least a lot faster. We could say that. That's objective. So this idea of where do robots and C. elegans fit? And I don't know. Maybe humans. I actually think octopuses go over here because they can make their bodies. They have these soft, mobile bodies. They have 8 arms relative to our 6 limbs. So I think that's curious. So, wrapping up, I'm going to show one slide about gait, which is that I don't want to make, so when we study gait in my lab, it's not to make one gait, it's to make hundreds of gaits, or at least 6 gaits that are perceptually distinct to human viewers. Because I want to broaden the complexity of my information source, because I want a thing that can be in different states and modes at different times. And that's a function of my system. If I added, these don't have torsos or faces or fingers or hands, if I added those parts, I could express more different states, right, at one time. I think that's just, pretty much information theory. So now we have this test bed. We are talking about using the arts as a test bed. I'm going to talk more about this tonight, but I'm going to show you some pictures, and I'm going to read you something that you need to hear. So, what is dance? You don't know. It is not a list, well, you might know, but many people think, oh, it's like this list of moves. Dance move A, dance move B. Here's the list of the dance moves, and all the other moves are not dance. Actually, so let me read this to you, and I hope that you'll see that this gives you a different sense of what dance is. And I'm going to animate it, because I know it would be boring if I just read it. So, Swan Lake is beautiful. It is delicate, graceful, enchanting. These qualitative words that we don't know the quantitative meaning of. Here's a picture of Swan Lake. This is like a classical Western. This is very Western-centric dance writing. Martha Graham's Night Journey is not. It is riveting, harrowing, horrifying, often ugly. So dance isn't about being beautiful. In fact, dance can be about the antithesis of beauty, the rejection of traditional forms of beauty. Yvonne Rayner's Trio A isn't even that. Being utterly pedestrian, it does not play on the emotions at all, but it is intriguing. Taking together, these 3 dances raise questions. What is dance up to? What does it do, and how does it do it? Wait, let me go back. Yvonne Rayner, it's not even about affect. Yvonne Rainer's work, I mean, she walks around on stage like this, and people went crazy for it because it was like, oh, that could also be dance. Like, dance doesn't have to be about putting on an extreme version of affect. In fact, in a daily day, we look more like this than we do, these really, Martha Graham, like putting a sword through her chest. So taken together, these three dances raise questions. What is dance up to? What does it do, and how does it do it? Night Journey discredits the thesis that the end of dance is beauty. Trio A discredits the thesis that the end is affective, with an A, or motive, engagement. Possibly dance as such has no end. Different works and different genres pursue different ends. But whether or not dance has a telos, questions arise. What does this particular dance do, and how does it do it? And why? My thesis is that dance embodies and conveys understanding. We emerge from a performance of such a work better equipped to recognize features like political ideas, emotions, in other situations where we encounter them. So dance is not about doing move A, then move B, then move C. It's inventing move Z, right, that no one has ever seen, and moving in a way that no one's ever quite used to express ideas, and thus express more ideas, right, and have a richer information source. When Yvonne Rainer created Trio A, she made the human knowledge, she expanded human knowledge. She expressed a new idea through a human moving body. And I think that's a really important distinction, and it's sort of how an academic department in dance will teach you to think about dance, but not always how the popularized idea of dance. So we dance with robots in my lab, and we try to think how many, can robots and humans express the same ideas through their bodies? And we often run user studies in the middle of that. And hopefully one day we'll have like a robust way of doing that that doesn't interfere with the engagement that one has while they're watching the piece, and that also collects interesting results. We have some initial publications asking things like an array of systems, how expressive are these? If we ask you to move with an array of systems, which we do, so this is an immersive performance, what do you think is controlling that object? And we give people different treatments. And a lot of this work is done by artists in my lab and artists in residence in my lab. Katie Kwan, who's now in the Bay Area again, was our first, and now we have Kate Leidenheim, who's thinking about the feminine experience in technology. So all of this stuff, communication through movement, it's essential to robots that function correctly. I hope that you believe that now, or that you at least think that it's a more complicated idea than maybe you thought before. I don't know. So. Yeah.
It's great, Katie. I'm sorry.
People get us confused. We worked very close.
There's always this idea that there's robotic movement, which is robot dance, and it has this, it's always about these jerky motions. And I'm just curious about the uncanny valley in this context. I mean, is there, you're sort of playing this idea of where do they become more similar? And I'm just curious how you think about the maintaining that gap, the distance between them.
I'm an uncanny valley denier.
Oh, you are?
Yes, I think that's a bullshit plot. And you actually, I have these slides which I made off your slides, and that explains that, but I resisted putting them here because I'm not trying to start a fight. But here's what I think. That x-axis, what does it mean to be human-like? I have no idea. I have seen little blubbery Pixar characters that have no legs and no arms and no head, and they are more expressive than any of the robots in my lab. So what does it mean to be human-like? I don't know. What I can do is count how many states each system can do. And so if that x-axis were expressivity, or as how I'm talking about it here, as one, or postural counts of how many things they can do in their postural space, that's something you can defend. That's objective, that's quantitative. But human likeness, we don't know how to measure that. So that x-axis is all messed up. And that y-axis, you know, is really hard for me as, you know, watching Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton go debate on a stage and then like think about who's likable, right? Like it's hard on me to think about, I don't know how to measure that either. And I know that there are examples of things that are likable for some people and not likable for other people, and a lot of times that's like a really complicated axis too. So maybe the uncanny valley exists, but I'm not convinced, right? I don't think those two axes can say anything about, and sometimes people use things on one side that are played by humans, like C3PO goes on that side, but it's played by a human. And on the other side, you know, you have Jimmy Fallon, but I know for a fact that I've been at the bottom of that uncanny valley myself. So because I say something maybe that my gender doesn't afford or something, right? So I mean, it's so messy and so complicated.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's the idea of quantifying it or treating it as a quantifiable graph is wrong. I agree. But I guess I'm just wondering.
But it could be quantifiable if we were careful about it. If we dug into what those words mean, if we measured perceptually what those words mean, we could quantify it, but we haven't. And we haven't because I think we frequently overlook how complicated something like grace is, right? Or how complicated human movement is. We watch Atlas do a backflip and we're like, done, check, good. Well, that's not how humans do backflips if you watch with a nuanced eye.
No, I think it's a great point. I guess I'm just getting at is that if something that may exist through even with expressivity, that there's something where if it gets too expressive, it actually takes backfire.
I will entertain that, and I actually think it's important for me to be a denier, and I'm going to stay that way till I die. But I think you can look at octopuses actually as an example of a creature that may be too expressive, that doesn't live very long, that hasn't been as effective as our design, which is probably, in the way I'm using the word, they are more there's more shapes you can make with their bodies than there are shapes you can make with our bodies, I think. I think that's pretty easy to defend. So you might be right. I think that's probably, but let me be the other end of the extreme, and then somewhere in between, like, is probably the right answer.
Going back to your slide with the C3PO. Okay.
Yeah.
Going back to your slide with the C3PO, I was wondering, you asked whether you could just put in the Boston Dynamics robot and have the same effect. But what's your notion about the physical appearance of the robots and how it is interpreted by the receiver?
Mm-hmm. It's a thing. It's a total thing, right? Apple versus Android is another thing.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the movement and the postural change.
Yeah,
but
I just
you're
saw
totally
that
right.
none of the models you used had a face, you know, and you write within social robotics, so I thought that maybe that was something to put into your models as well.
The face is huge. The face is super helpful. The face is a wonderful. I think of the face a little bit like I think of LEDs. I think of LEDs as dynamically unconstrained degrees of freedom that we can, even when our motors are kind of crappy, we could like add lights, and like we've done that. That little red robot that we built, we added these lights so it could kind of seem like it was breathing. The face is kind of like that. Like I can stand here on one leg, and now all of a sudden the things I can do with my body is really limited.
Yeah.
But I could still change my face and like communicate to you like what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I just focus on the postural component and the body component because that's, I mean, dance also thinks about the face, but I mean the emphasis is like I'm really far away from you and you're looking at my body, right? And how is my body moving? But oh yeah, we need social roboticists thinking about face.
And
I just don't.
And they do.
And they do.
Yeah. Thank you.
And they do. Yeah. And you could add a face. You could add a little LCD screen to Big Dog, right? That says, "I am pointing, I am leaning," and then there you go. Now, I don't think that's. We hope to have something a little more immediate, a little more visceral. We hope to endow these human-facing environments that are supposedly going to have robots in them one day with texture and quality, just like we painted this wall with wood and we made these chairs purple because we don't want to go into a room that feels the same all the time everywhere, you know. So yeah, I think.
No, the reason why I asked was also because the Boston Dynamics robot seems a bit like an animal to me, whereas compared to C3PO seems more android or human-like.
Yeah, but I could stick my dog there, and he'd do a lot better than Boston Dynamics' big dog.
Okay.
He has
I'd
these
li-
very expressive eyes. He's the
I'd like
cutest
to-
dog in the
I'd like
world,
to
so
meet
he has
your
a
dog.
special ability. Yeah, no. Thank you, guys.